What is up, everybody? I am Ryan from Minus the Gym, and last week I uploaded a video about the 100 push-up and 100 pull-up a day challenge. Now, after I completed that challenge, my back was so tight, I actually pulled my left rhomboid, a muscle in my back, when I was practicing handstands. So that got me thinking, in calisthenics, no matter how careful you are, you're going to pull a muscle now and then. It happens. So why not make a video about calisthenics, the injuries you might encounter, and how to prevent them and treat them when they happen. So when you strain a muscle, what you're basically doing is overstretching it. You could be also tearing the muscle. Hopefully that's not the case. But you overstretch it. It stretches more than it's used to or more than it's currently capable of. And that puts a strain on the muscle tissue, leading to swelling and inflammation. The best way to avoid muscle strains altogether is to properly warm up before you work out. Make sure you stretch regularly. That's going to help as well. And if you're really tight, maybe you're working a muscle more than usual, like I was when I was doing 100 pull-ups a day and my back was really tight, you should foam roll. All right, foam rolling is a type of myofascial release, like massage, basically, self-massage. And that's going to help keep the tissue kind of loose and more flexible and help avoid injury. No matter which muscle you strain in your body, the treatment remains the same. And you can remember the treatment with the acronym R.I.C.E, R-I-C-E. And R.I.C.E stands for rest, ice, compression, and elevation. First, we'll take a look at rest. And when I say rest, I mean that you need to identify the movements that cause you pain. In my case, I noticed that tilting my head to the right caused pain in my left rhomboid, and so did protracting the scapula, meaning reaching forward so that my shoulder blades move apart. Once you identify which movements are causing you pain, you need to do everything you can to avoid those movements. That's what rest is all about. Ice. Alright, this one's pretty simple. What you want to do is find an ice pack or a bag of ice cubes is fine. Wrap it in a towel so it's not too cold against you, and then hold it on the injured area of your body. Compression. Okay, compression will also help with the swelling and inflammation. So here you can see with the example of my left rhomboid, you can take an ACE bandage and wrap it around the area, and here I have an ice pack under the ACE bandage. So this is actually killing two birds with one stone because I'm applying ice and compression at the same time. Now, in some cases, an ACE bandage might be overkill, for instance, if you've injured your wrist, in which case it's nice to have wrist support straps, or here, like what I have, is workout gloves with built-in wrist support straps. These are great for compression when you have a wrist injury. And lastly, elevation. So in the example we've been looking at with my left rhomboid, that's not a good example because the rhomboid is actually at heart level. So let's say, for instance, you injured your knee. It's good to put your legs up on something like a couch while you're laying on the floor like I'm doing here, and that way you're elevating the injured area above heart level. Elevating the injured area will help reduce the blood flow, hence reducing the inflammation and swelling. And if I were to tie an ACE bandage around this, I'd be applying ice, compression, and elevation all at the same time. And a quick word on painkillers. Whether it's Tylenol, Advil, aspirin, ibuprofen, or something else, the thing you got to keep in mind about painkiller meds is that they relieve the pain and kind of numb you from it so that you're not aware, you're not in touch with which range of motion is further aggravating the affected tissue. So only take pain meds if you truly cannot bear the pain. Otherwise, just avoid the range of motion that hurts and you'll be fine. Alright, you'll have to forgive me, I'm making myself some lunch while I shoot this video. So another common injury you're likely to encounter with calisthenics is tendinitis. Tendinitis is when your tendon, right, it's connective tissue in a joint, becomes swollen and inflamed. So it's similar to a muscle strain, but we're talking about connective tissue instead of muscle. Just like with a muscle strain, R.I.C.E applies to tendinitis as well. So you want to lay off the tendon, whatever exercise is causing this. For me it was my wrists with handstands, definitely had some joint pain while I was learning handstands. Also my elbows from doing weighted pull-ups. When I started adding weight to my pull-ups, it was like tennis elbow kind of feeling. So when you experience that, identify whichever exercise is causing that joint pain, lay off the exercise, and actually go back to a previous progression. So kind of take a step back and make sure you implement R.I.C.E. So you're doing rest, right, laying off the exercise, you're icing, compressing, and elevating the injured joint. So that's tendinitis, but what about falls? All right, falls are another big one, and I have fallen more times than I'm willing to admit, but I will say that I have fallen out of a headstand, multiple handstands, as well as off a pull-up bar, and it is not fun. So make sure you take every precaution you can to not fall. But before we get into the precautions, I want to mention that R.I.C.E. also applies to falls. So if you get a bump or a bruise from a fall, you can use rest, ice, compression, elevation for that as well. But if you think you broke a bone or have a fracture, definitely go get it checked out by a doctor, okay? Don't just assume it's going to be fine. You should go get checked out to get an x-ray and see what happened. Real quick, let's talk about the precautions you can take to avoid a fall. If you're using a doorway pull-up bar, always make sure that crossbar is safely and securely resting on the door jamb. I always check that. And I also like to do a test hang with my feet right above the floor before I start doing pull-ups. That way I know I won't fall. The last thing you want is to be hanging from that bar in some vulnerable position and then have it give way so you fall and hit the floor. And on that note, if you're doing any sort of inverted hangs where if you fall you might land on your neck or your head, make sure that you're doing it on a low bar like I'm doing here on the dip station. And of course, when working on inversions such as the headstand, make sure you have a wall behind you in case you fall. And the same goes for handstands, all right? Before you learn to bail, make sure you're using the wall for safety. So basically, just remember R.I.C.E. Okay, rest, ice, compression, elevation. If you remember those 4 things, you can apply that to bumps and bruises, tendinitis, and muscle strains. Anything with swelling and inflammation will benefit from it. And of course, take every measure you can to play it safe, right? You don't want to fall or take any risks of falling. It's not worth it. And real quick before I end this video, I want to tell you about the lunch I made. I used this grain called spelt that I recently discovered at Whole Foods. And what you do is you soak the spelt berries in water overnight, just like this in a bowl. And then after you wake up, you drain and rinse them. Then simmer them for about 60 minutes using 3 cups water per 1 cup spelt. The end result is this really delicious and highly nutritious whole grain that I mixed with some raw veggies, and when I plugged it into Chronometer, I was surprised at just how nutritious it really is. So I had 2 cups of spelt in this meal, and if you look, it's 21 grams of protein, which is actually really good for a whole grain. That's a lot of protein. Looking down here, a lot of B vitamins as well, especially B3. Over half my B3 for the day I got from that. And most impressive were the minerals. I mean, if you look, copper, 93%. I mean, most of my copper, most of my iron for the day. I got plenty of manganese. Even down there, zinc, almost 50% of my zinc. And up here to the left, you can see fiber, almost half my fiber for the day, just from this 2 cups of spelt. So I ended up pouring my favorite sauce over this. That's a garlic roasted red pepper sauce that I make. It was absolutely delicious, and I highly recommend you try out spelt if you haven't already. And that's it for this video, guys. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll talk to you in the next one.